The fog rolling off the River Rea in late 19th century Birmingham didn't hide monsters or ghosts. It hid something much more grounded and far more terrifying. A generation of young men with nothing to lose and a brutal reputation to uphold. While millions of people around the world have fallen in love with the cinematic, sharp-dressed, and calculated world of Tommy Shelby, the true story of the Peaky Blinders is a tale of a much darker, grittier, and less organized reality. If you want to understand the soul of industrial England and the birth of the modern street gang, you have to look past the slow-motion walks and the rock music. To find the origin of the real Peaky Blinders, we have to travel back to the 1890s, not the 1920s as the show suggests. Birmingham was the workshop of the world, a place of iron, smoke, and crushing poverty. Long before the Blinders became a household name, the streets were ruled by groups known as sloggers. These were early street gangs like the Cheapside Sloggers, who would engage in massive brawls involving hundreds of people at a time. In the cramped slums of Small Heath and Cheapside, life was cheap, and the law was often a distant suggestion. The term Peaky Blinder first appeared in the local press following a brutal assault in March 1890. A man named George Eastwood was drinking ginger beer at a pub when he was set upon by a group of youths simply because he didn't fit their social mold. This wasn't a tactical hit by a criminal empire. It was a mindless act of street violence that left the victim with a fractured skull. The name itself is the subject of one of history's most persistent myths. The television series popularized the idea that these gangsters sewed disposable razor blades into the peaks of their caps to use as weapons in a fight. It's a brilliant piece of fiction, but in reality, safety razors were an expensive luxury item in the 1890s, costing nearly a week's wages for a working-class man. The idea of using them in a cap is practically impossible and historically inaccurate. A more likely explanation is that the term came from their distinctive style. These men wore peaked caps pulled low over one eye, effectively blinding their own vision on one side, or perhaps it was a bit of local slang. Blinder was a term for someone who looked particularly striking or well-dressed. While the fictional Shelbys are portrayed as a wealthy, organized crime family with political aspirations, the real Peaky Blinders were mostly small-time hoodlums. Their business wasn't high-stakes international arms dealing or fixing horse races at the highest levels of government. Instead, they survived on petty theft, racketeering, and brutal street fighting. Interestingly, unlike the show where women often play central roles in the business, the real female counterparts were known as molls. These women were often just as fierce as the men, identifiable by their specific look. They wore long fringes that covered their foreheads and silk scarves knotted tightly around their necks. These women were status symbols. The more pearls and silk a woman wore, the more successful her partner was in his criminal dealings. The weapons of choice for the real gang were far more primitive than the submachine guns seen on screen. They relied on heavy leather belts with large, weighted brass buckles. They would wrap the leather around their hands and swing the buckle with lethal force, a technique that could easily crack a skull or blind an opponent. They also utilized life preservers, which were essentially short, weighted clubs, and their heavy, steel-tipped boots. A Peaky Blinder was known for a specific type of brutal kicking during a fight, aiming for the shins and ribs of anyone who dared to stand in their way. One of the most striking differences between history and fiction lies in the leadership and age of the members. There was no single Tommy Shelby who ruled Birmingham with a cold, calculating brilliance. Instead, there were figures like Henry Lightfoot, the first man ever officially recorded as a Peaky Blinder in police reports. He was a hardened brawler who had been in and out of prison since his youth. Then there were the younger faces, like David Taylor, who was arrested at just 13 years old for carrying a loaded firearm. When you look at the mugshots from the West Midlands police archives, you don't see the polished faces of Hollywood stars. You see hardened, tired young men, many of whom were barely old enough to shave, but had already spent years in the brutal English penal system of hard labor and bread and water diets. A little-known fact is that the gang was heavily involved in what they called post office robberies and muggings of the elderly, which paints a much less heroic picture than the television series. They were also deeply involved in slum clearance resistance, often fighting the police who tried to enforce order in their neighborhoods. The fall of the real Peaky Blinders was not a grand cinematic finale. They were eventually pushed out of power not by a rival foreign mafia, but by a larger, even more violent group known as the Birmingham Boys, led by Billy Kimber. In real life, Kimber was a formidable force who actually controlled most of the racecourses in England. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the era when the show begins, the Peaky Blinders as a distinct gang had largely vanished, replaced by more professional criminal organizations that had traded street brawls for sophisticated illegal bookmaking. The decline of the gang was also hastened by the emergence of the sloggers hunters, police officers who were specifically recruited for their size and fighting ability. These officers were given a green light to use physical force to reclaim the streets of Birmingham. By the early 1900s, many of the original gang members had either died, were serving long sentences, or had been forced into the military. The term Peaky Blinder eventually became a generic term for any violent youth in the city, rather than a specific gang with a unified leader. Comparing the two worlds reveals a fascinating truth about how we consume history. We want our villains to be complicated, brilliant, and perhaps even a little heroic. We want to believe that there was a grand design behind the chaos. The real story is much more tragic. It is a story of urban decay, of a lack of education and opportunity, and of young men who used violence as a language because they were never taught another. The legacy of the Peaky Blinders survives today because they represent a time when the city was a place of extreme transition, caught between the Victorian era and the modern world. They were the original rough diamonds, men who dressed like kings while living in the dirt. Thank you for exploring the dark alleys of Victorian Birmingham with me today. If you found this deep dive into the real history behind the myth compelling, please hit the like button. It helps this independent content reach more people who crave the truth behind the legends. What surprised you most about the real Peaky Blinders? Was it the myth of the razor blades, or the fact that they used heavy belt buckles as weapons? Let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing your thoughts on how history compares to our favorite stories. If you want to keep uncovering the unfiltered truth about the people and events that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. To continue your journey through history right now, click on the video on your screen to explore another incredible story. Until next time, keep searching for the truth and move forward.